They called my land worthless for almost 40 years. 84 acres of rock, scrub grass, and thin soil on the north ridge of Cedar Hollow. Too steep for crops, too dry for cattle, too ugly for developers unless I sold it cheap enough to make them smile. My name is Elias Carter, and by the time I turned 68, half the town had decided I was just an old fool protecting a dead piece of ground. Even my daughter stopped asking if I would sell and started asking what I was trying to prove. But inside my grandfather's cedar box was one old map, folded so many times the paper felt like cloth. And in one corner of that map was a mark no one had ever bothered to read. One small detail. That was all it took to turn worthless land into the most valuable ground in the county. The Carter place sat where Cedar Hollow stopped pretending to be gentle. Down in the valley, farms rolled soft and green along the county road with white fences, red barns, and fields that looked good in real estate flyers. But my land climbed north, past the last mailbox, into a ridge of shale, cedar, and stubborn grass. In spring, it bloomed just enough to fool you. By August, the wind stripped it back down to bone. My grandfather bought it in 1938 when people still judged land by walking it instead of pricing it from an office. He raised sheep there for a while, then cattle, then mostly hope. My father held on after him. By the time the land came to me, most folks figured the Carter men had spent 3 generations refusing to admit a bad purchase. I never argued. That was one of my worst habits. I let people think what they wanted, because explaining felt too much like begging. If a man could not see the value of a thing, I figured words would not open his eyes. That silence cost me more than I understood. My daughter Margaret understood numbers better than memories. She was 42, practical as a fence post, with 2 kids of her own and a mortgage that never stopped breathing down her neck. Every month, she came by with groceries she pretended were extra and bills she pretended not to notice on my kitchen table. "Dad," she said one cold Tuesday morning, tapping the tax notice with her finger, "you don't have to sell all of it. Just the north slope. Nobody uses it." I kept my coffee cup between both hands. "Your grandfather used to say the north slope mattered." Her face tightened. Not in anger exactly, but in exhaustion. Granddad said a lot of things. He also didn't live to see these property taxes. She was right about that. The bank had already leaned on me twice that year. I had mortgaged my baler, my old tractor, and the flatbed trailer I used during hay season. I had sold off most of the cattle before winter feed prices climbed again. What remained of my herd stood behind the barn like witnesses to a trial I was slowly losing. And across the fence, Owen Briggs waited. Owen owned the broad pasture east of mine, clean land with clean money behind it. He had been trying to buy my ridge for 12 years, not because he believed in it, because he wanted the acreage to round out his holdings. Maybe lease it later. Maybe sit on it until someone else found a use. His latest offer came in a cream envelope, hand-delivered by his ranch manager. Low, polite, final. At the bottom, Owen had written one sentence in blue ink. "Elias, don't let pride turn useless land into family trouble." I folded the letter once and set it beside the cedar box on my shelf. That box was the only thing in the room older than my worry, and inside it was the map everyone had forgotten. That night, after Margaret left, I took the cedar box down from the shelf. The hinges complained the same way they had since I was a boy. Inside, everything smelled faintly of dust, dry wood, and the tobacco my grandfather used to keep in his shirt pocket. There was his brass compass, green around the edges. A few folded receipts from the feed store. A photograph of him standing beside a mule team with one hand on his hip like he owned the whole mountain. And under all of it was the map. I laid it on the kitchen table and smoothed the corners with my palms. The paper had yellowed to the color of old hay. The lines were hand-drawn, careful but imperfect, showing fence posts, creek beds that had gone dry, and a crooked boundary along the ridge where the surveyor must have fought wind the whole day. I had looked at that map more times than I could count, but I never looked at it without hearing my grandfather's voice. "Land talks slow. Eli," he used to say. "Most men walk away before it finishes the sentence." Near the upper corner, just below the north slope, was the little mark, a triangle, no bigger than a grain of corn, with two faded initials beside it. Not a house, not a well, not a fence corner. Every county copy I had ever seen showed it too, but nobody at the courthouse ever explained it. Years earlier, when I was still young enough to think officials had answers, I asked a clerk about it. She glanced at the paper for less than 5 seconds and said, "Probably an old marker. Nothing important." Nothing important? Those words had followed that ridge for decades. I turned the map sideways, then unfolded the brittle note tucked behind it. My grandfather had written it in pencil, the letters thin from age. "Never sell before someone finally asks why." That was all. No explanation, no proof, no promise of gold or water or anything a banker could put in a report. Just a sentence from a dead man who had walked the land before the roads were paved. I wanted to believe it was enough. But belief looks different when the house is cold and the bills are stacked beside your supper plate. For the first time in years, I felt anger rise in me, not at Owen Briggs, not at Margaret, not even at the town, at myself. Maybe I had mistaken loyalty for wisdom. Maybe I had protected a mystery because admitting I did not understand it would make me feel like I had failed my father and his father before him. I folded the note carefully. Then I did something I had avoided for too long. I called the county survey office and asked if anyone could tell me what that tiny triangle really meant. The woman on the phone paused. Then she said, "Mr. Carter, you may want to bring the original map in." I should have gone to the survey office quietly. That would have been the smart way. But Cedar Hollow was the kind of town where a man could sneeze near the courthouse and hear about it at the cafe before lunch. By 10 the next morning, 3 people already knew I had brought in an old map. By noon, they had turned it into a joke. I found that out when I stopped at Miller's Cafe for coffee. The bell above the door rang, and the talking changed. It did not stop exactly. It just softened, the way a room does when people want you to know they were speaking about you without having to admit it. Owen Briggs sat in the corner booth with Mayor Helen Brooks and 2 men from the county planning board. Owen looked up, smiled politely, and lifted his cup. "Morning, Elias," he said. "Heard you're hunting treasure now." A few people laughed into their plates. I walked to the counter and ordered coffee black. Helen Brooks tried to sound kinder than the joke deserved. "Nobody means anything by it? Elias, folks are just worried about you." Worried. That was the word people used when they wanted permission to judge you gently. Owen leaned back in his seat. If there was anything valuable under that ridge, someone would have found it by now. "You know that." I looked at him. "No," I said. "I know someone would have priced it by now." The room went quiet for half a breath. Then someone near the window chuckled. That small laugh followed me all the way back to the truck. Margaret was waiting on my porch when I got home. She had heard too. Of course she had. Her arms were crossed tight against the cold, and her eyes were tired before she even spoke. "Dad, please tell me you didn't take that old map downtown like it was evidence." It is evidence of something. Of what? I did not answer fast enough. That was the trouble with me. I could stand against a buyer, a banker, or a whole room full of gossip. But when my daughter looked at me like I was disappearing behind my own pride, I had no defense. She stepped closer. Do you understand what this looks like? Hey, you're behind on payments, you sold the cattle, you mortgaged equipment you still need, and now people think you're chasing symbols on paper. I wanted to tell her about the note, about my grandfather, about the way his hand shook the last time he made me promise not to sell the ridge cheap. Instead, I said, I'm doing what I think is right. Margaret's face fell. That's not an explanation. Dad, that's a wall. She left without coming inside. After her car disappeared down the gravel road, I stood on the porch and watched the North Ridge darken under the evening clouds. For the first time, the land did not look patient. It looked lonely. 2 days later, Grace Nolan walked into the county survey office and changed the shape of the story without meaning to. She was not there for me. That mattered. Grace worked for an independent geological firm out of Helena, hired to review land stability for a proposed county service road that would run several miles beyond my property. She was 46, calm-eyed, with a field jacket faded at the shoulders and a habit of listening before she spoke. I noticed that right away, because most people in Cedar Hollow had already decided what they thought before I opened my mouth. The county clerk called me that morning. Mr. Carter, someone here would like to look at your original map. I almost said no. Old habit. Instead, I wrapped the map in brown paper, placed it back inside the cedar box, and drove into town with both hands tight on the wheel. Grace was standing over a table when I arrived, comparing a modern plat map with an enlarged copy of mine. She did not laugh when she saw the cedar box. She did not smile like she was humoring an old man. She simply put on cotton gloves before touching the paper. That small respect nearly undid me. She studied the boundary lines first, then the dry creek beds, then the North Ridge. When her finger reached the little triangle, she stopped. How long has this mark been copied into county records, she asked. The clerk shrugged. As long as I've seen it. We assumed it was an old corner notation. Grace leaned closer. It's not drawn like a property corner. I felt my breath slow. What is it, then? I don't know yet. She looked up at me, but these initials beside it may belong to a surveyor who also worked early mineral assessments before the war. The room became very still. The clerk blinked. Mineral assessments. Grace did not answer her. She was already taking photos, measuring the mark against the map scale, checking the ridge coordinates against her tablet. Then she asked a question no one had asked in all the years I had carried that map. Mr. Carter, has anyone ever sampled the North Slope? I thought of every man who had called it useless, every appraiser who had stood near the fence for 10 minutes and written down poor grazing condition, every buyer who had priced the land by what it could not grow. No, I said. Nobody ever thought it was worth the trouble. Grace folded her arms and looked through the window toward the mountains. Sometimes that is exactly why old notes survive, she said, because nobody bothered to prove them wrong. By sunset, 2 white survey trucks were parked at the edge of my north pasture, and by morning, half of Cedar Hollow had driven past slow enough to stare. The survey trucks made everything worse before they made anything better. That is how truth often arrives in a small town, not as an answer, but as a disturbance. Grace's crew set orange flags along the north slope, then hauled equipment up the ridge where the wind cut sideways through the cedar trees. They took measurements, checked old coordinates, and marked 3 possible sampling points near the tiny triangle from my grandfather's map. By noon, cars were slowing on the county road. By 3, Owen Briggs had driven over himself. He stepped out of his truck wearing a clean wool coat that did not belong near a muddy pasture. He looked at the survey flags, then at me, then back toward the ridge. "Elias," he said, "you realize this doesn't change my offer." "I didn't ask it to." His jaw tightened. "I'm trying to help you before this turns embarrassing." I almost laughed at that, not because it was funny, but because embarrassment had become so common around me it felt like weather. Before I could answer, my son Luke pulled into the drive. Luke was 37, broad like my father had been, but with city shoes and a life built far from cattle fences. He came because Margaret called him. I knew that before he even got out of the car. He walked past Owen without speaking. "Dad," he said quietly, "we need to talk inside." We did not make it inside. He stopped beside the porch, looked toward the ridge, and lowered his voice. "Are you paying for this?" "No." "Then, who is?" "Independent firm, county project nearby." He rubbed both hands over his face. "And you think this means something?" "I think someone finally asked the right question." Luke looked at me the way Margaret had, only with more hurt than anger. "You keep saying things like that. Do you know how hard it is to defend you when you won't explain anything?" Those words landed harder than Owen's offer ever had. Because Luke was not trying to buy the land. He was trying to find his father behind it. That evening, the bank called again. Not with threats. Banks rarely need threats. The woman simply reminded me that winter payments were coming due, and if I missed another deadline, they would have to review available remedies. Available remedies. A soft phrase for losing what your family bled into the soil. After the call, I sat at the kitchen table with the cedar box open in front of me. For the first time, I wondered if keeping the land had become selfish. Maybe Margaret and Luke were right. Maybe honoring the dead had cost the living too much. Outside, the drilling rig groaned against the ridge. Inside, I held my grandfather's note and realized something painful. Faith can look a lot like pride when you refuse to share the burden. Grace did not announce anything the first day. That was the first reason I trusted her. Most people in Cedar Hollow would have rushed a rumor to the cafe before the dust settled. Grace did the opposite. She grew quieter. Her crew took the first core sample from the lower shoulder of the ridge, sealed it, labeled it, and sent it to their mobile unit without celebration. By late afternoon, she asked permission to take a second sample higher up. "Is that normal?" I asked. "Normal enough," she said. But her eyes stayed on the old map. The second drilling point was harder to reach. The rig had to crawl over broken shale, and twice the wheels slipped before the crew laid down steel mats. I stood beside the fence with my coat collar turned up, watching men work ground everyone else had dismissed as useless. Margaret came near sunset. She did not say much at first, just stood beside me, arms folded, looking toward the orange flags. Finally, she asked, "Do you really believe Granddad knew something?" I looked at the ridge. I believe he noticed something nobody wanted to carry forward. That's not the same thing. "No," I said, "it isn't." The honesty surprised both of us. I reached into my coat and handed her the folded note from the cedar box. She read it once, then again, her expression changing in small ways I could not name. "Why didn't you show us this before?" "Because I was afraid you'd think it wasn't enough." That was the truth. But I had hidden behind silence too long. I thought protecting it meant carrying it alone. I said, "I was wrong about that." Margaret looked down at the note, then back at me. Her eyes were wet, but her voice stayed steady. "Dad, we weren't asking you to stop loving the land. We were asking you to let us understand why." Before I could answer, Grace called from the ridge. Her crew had pulled the second core. Even from where I stood, I could see the difference. The sample was darker than expected, threaded with a strange metallic glint near the center. Grace did not smile. She only stepped closer to the work light and examined it through a hand lens. Then she looked down the slope at me. "Mr. Carter," she said, "we need to run confirmation tests." Owen Briggs had parked by the road again. I saw him watching from behind his windshield. For the first time in 12 years, he did not look certain. That night, Grace asked the county to delay any land use recommendations near my ridge until her firm completed verification. She gave no public explanation. But in a town built on gossip, silence can be louder than shouting. By morning, nobody was laughing about treasure anymore. The confirmation took 3 days. Those were the longest 3 days I had lived through since my wife passed. Grace's crew came and went with sealed cases, field tablets, and faces trained not to reveal what they suspected. They took water readings from old depressions near the ridge. They measured rock density. They compared my grandfather's map against federal geological records no one in Cedar Hollow had thought to request. Meanwhile, the town filled the silence with guesses. At Miller's Cafe, people who had laughed now spoke in lower voices. At the feed store, men stopped talking when I walked in. Owen Briggs stopped sending offers, which somehow felt louder than all the ones before. On the third afternoon, Grace asked me to come to town hall. Not the courthouse. Not the cafe. Town hall. Margaret drove me. Luke came too. Nobody said much in the truck, but Margaret held the cedar box on her lap like it was no longer a burden, but a witness. Inside the meeting room, Mayor Helen Brooks stood with 2 county officials, Owen Briggs, a planning board member, and Grace's senior technician. I felt every eye turn toward me. For a moment, I was back in the cafe, hearing laughter soften behind coffee cups. Grace placed 3 documents on the table. The original map notation, she said, was not a property marker. It appears to reference an early geological observation made in 1938 by a surveyor who had experience documenting mineral formations. Owen shifted in his chair. Grace continued. Our core samples confirm a significant mineral-bearing formation beneath the North Ridge. The room went still. Then she placed the second report beside the first. More importantly, groundwater imaging indicates a protected aquifer system running under the same section of land. Based on preliminary measurements, it may be one of the largest clean freshwater reserves in this part of the county. Nobody spoke. Not Mayor Brooks. Not Owen. Not even me. For 40 years, people had looked at my land and seen only what the surface refused to give them: grass too thin, soil too poor, rock too hard. All that time, the value had been underneath. Grace turned one page and pointed to the tiny triangle enlarged in black ink. This detail was copied into later maps but never interpreted. Mr. Carter's original map allowed us to identify what modern reviews missed. Mayor Brooks looked at me then, and I saw something I had not seen from this town in years. Shame. Owen cleared his throat. Are you saying the land is worth? Grace stopped him gently. I'm saying it should not be priced casually. That sentence settled over the room like snow. Margaret reached for my hand under the table, and for the first time in a long while, I let someone hold part of the weight. By the next morning, everybody wanted to talk. People who had not called me in years suddenly had questions about the ridge. A broker from Billings left 2 messages before breakfast. A mineral company sent an email so polished it felt like it had never touched dirt. Owen Briggs drove up before noon, this time without his ranch manager, his wool coat, or that easy certainty he used to wear like a second hat. He stood near my porch steps with his hat in both hands, Shumna. Elias, he said. "I owe you an apology." I looked past him toward the North Ridge. The orange flag still flickered in the wind, small and bright against all that stone. "For what part?" He swallowed. It was not a cruel question, just an honest one. "For assuming I knew what your land was worth," he said, "and for treating your refusal like foolishness. There was a time I would have taken that apology and locked it away like proof. A time I would have wanted the whole town lined up behind him, each person admitting they had been wrong. But victory feels different when it arrives late. It does not erase the years. It does not pay back every lonely evening at the kitchen table. It does not give my children back the peace my silence took from them." So I only nodded. "Thank you, Owen." He glanced toward the ridge. "You'll have offers now. Real ones. I know. Some men would sell and never look back. I'm not some men." A week earlier, that would have sounded stubborn. Now, even to me, it sounded like a responsibility. That evening, Margaret, Luke, and I sat at the kitchen table with Grace's preliminary report between us and the cedar box at the center. For once, I did not make decisions alone. Luke asked hard questions. Margaret wrote numbers in a notebook. We talked about taxes, legal protections, mineral rights, water rights, conservation easements, and what kind of future would honor the land without letting money destroy it. The easiest choice would have been selling everything. The richest choice, too. But the best choice was harder. We agreed to protect the aquifer first. No drilling, no careless extraction, no deal that treated water like a prize to be grabbed. Part of the ridge would become a conservation trust. Part of the lower pasture would stay in family use. Any mineral study would be limited, reviewed, and tied to scholarships for rural students studying geology, water management, and agriculture. Margaret looked at me over the papers. "Granddad didn't leave us a treasure map," she said softly. I touched the cedar box. "No," I said. "He left us a question." Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass. For the first time in years, it did not sound like warning. It sounded like an answer taking its time. The first sign came down quietly. It was the old "for sale by owner" board Owen's ranch manager had nailed near my fence years ago as a joke after I refused another offer. I had never taken it down because part of me wanted the reminder. Pride does strange things with pain. This time, Luke pulled it from the post himself. Margaret stood beside him, holding the cedar box wrapped in a clean cloth. Her children ran ahead toward the ridge, careful to stay behind the new markers Grace's crew had placed for the conservation boundary. 3 months later, Cedar Hollow held a small ceremony at the County Historical Museum. I almost refused to go. Crowds still made me uncomfortable, and praise felt heavier than ridicule in its own way. But Margaret put her hand on my arm and said, "Dad, this isn't just for you." She was right. The original map sat behind glass now, preserved under soft light. Beside it was my grandfather's brass compass, his unfinished note, and an enlarged photograph of the tiny triangle that had changed everything. Mayor Helen Brooks spoke first. She did not make excuses. She did not dress the past up in pretty language. "We called land worthless because we did not understand it," she said. "And we called a man stubborn because he remembered what the rest of us forgot." I looked down at my hands. They were still the same hands, weathered, scarred, and slow to open. But Margaret took one and Luke took the other. After the ceremony, Owen Briggs came over with his hat in his hand again. This time, he did not mention offers or value. "My grandson signed up for that scholarship fund," he said, "wants to study groundwater." I smiled a little. Good. Tell him to ask better questions than we did. By spring, the North Ridge had a new name on the county map, Carter Conservation Ridge. Not because I asked for it, but because the town voted for it. The lower pasture stayed ours. The aquifer stayed protected. The mineral formation remained studied, not stripped. And every few weeks, school children came up the hill with teachers, notebooks, and muddy shoes. They stood where grown men once laughed and learned how an old map could hold a truth too small for careless eyes. One afternoon, my granddaughter pointed to the ridge and asked, "Grandpa, was it always valuable?" I thought about that for a long time. Then I said, "Yes, we were just late noticing." The land never became a gold mine because people finally named its worth. It had been waiting all along. Waiting under stone. Waiting under silence. Waiting for someone willing to read the story carefully enough to understand what had been there from the start. Before you go, I hope Elias's story reminds you that not everything valuable is obvious at first glance. Sometimes the greatest treasures in life are hidden beneath years of doubt, quiet perseverance, and faith that refuses to give up. Whether it's a piece of land, a lifelong dream, or a promise made to someone you love, don't let other people's opinions define its worth. The world often rewards those who are patient enough to keep believing when everyone else has already walked away. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever held on to something others thought was worthless, only to discover its true value later? Share your story in the comments below. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories about resilience, family, and the quiet strength of ordinary people, please subscribe to the channel and join our growing community. Your support helps us bring you a new inspiring story every week.